Welcome to the latest in the Compliance Factory's series of conversations about anti-money laundering and remediation projects. My name is Adam Samuel, and I'm here with Malachy McClelland to talk about beneficial ownership. What's the problem with beneficial ownership in the anti-money laundering area?
Firms need to know their customers. That's required under the regulations. So if you have an individual client, that's a bit more straightforward. You know who the individual is and you verify the identity. But if the client is a more complex structure, like a corporate client, for example, or a trust, then knowing who controls these clients may not be so straightforward.
So what are the requirements in this area?
Well, to take any entity, the firms need to know who controls the company or the trust or whatever entity, whether it be a partnership or whatever the nature of the client. The firm needs to know who's behind that. So for a low-risk client, corporate client in the UK, for example, firms would need to know who the ultimate beneficial owners are, up to 25% of the ownership.
So, and that's to do with the registration requirements in the Fourth Money Laundering Directive, which requires, in the UK, for example, a UK company incorporated here to disclose that information essentially to Companies House.
Yes, but firms will want to know who owns the shares of the company and who controls it. As I say, up to 25% is the requirement certainly for low risk clients. In practice, firms will ask for more detail under higher risk clients, and they'll usually ask up to 10% of the ownership for high risk clients.
Yes, because the register of people with significant control is going to give you only up to 20%, only people with over 25% in practice, because there's no obligation to register any more detail. Can you actually get more information by just searching Companies House under the more mainstream parts of the register?
Well, sometimes the details on Companies House, the company itself might provide the information. There may be a share register. So there may be other sources of information you could obtain. It's not just on the register you mentioned. As I say, the firms have to satisfy themselves through their own research and the information they've obtained that they know who the owners are behind these clients.
But way below 25%, you could have very serious levels of control, particularly if, say, 10% shareholders are sitting there, effectively not on this register and not on the EU equivalents.
Yeah, you would hope that if there are issues around, the ownership, or there are any other risk factors, well, you wouldn't just hope, you would expect firms, and they're required to do further due diligence on those clients to establish the ownership and more details around the client.
In practice, have you ever searched for a EU state's details about a company incorporated outside the UK?
Yes, and very often you can find those information in EU registers. It's not always as straightforward sometimes, depending on the country, but there is information in the public domain in a lot of these countries. But you would very often be relying on other sources of information, including share registers from the providers.
There are concerns in this area about bearer shares. What's the problem?
Well, the problem with the bearer shares is that the main problem is that you maybe are not always clear who owns the actual shares, because it can be passed around. It's actually a physical document that can be passed from one owner to the next. But there are requirements around that. I mean, the company has to satisfy itself who actually owns a share at this time. The time is that the entity is the client, and there should be a register, and that register should be a register showing who the actual owners are.
So a small number of bearer shares might not be a concern, but it starts to climb around the 10% mark. You'd be very, very concerned that you might actually have a politically exposed person who owns a significant amount of the company.
Yeah, and again, firms will want to know who owns the bearer shares. As you say, they will then do further due diligence to establish whether or not there are PEPs, for example.
Is there a concern with nominee accounts, nominee shareholders?
Well, nominee shareholders create their own difficulties in that, first of all, you'd want to establish why there are nominee shareholders. The reasons can be perfectly legitimate, but you need to know that. You need to establish why the company's set up in this way. And certainly if the structure is more complex than you'd expect, why it's set up like that, and who are the owners behind the nominee shareholdings.
Yes, because if you've got a small number of nominee shareholdings, they may just be shares held by individual investors using platforms, with the nominee status being used purely for convenience purposes. So presumably, as long as once you go above 10%, the owners are pretty visible, you're not too concerned, or you can't be too concerned.
Well, if you've established that and you can document that, and the reason for the nominee shareholding, then you can satisfy yourself that you know your customer.
Moving on to trusts, there's a register of trusts in the UK. It's the Trust Registration Service. I have to look at that on my notes. The Trust Registration Service. Are there any limits or requirements that we need to know about here?
Well, again, as I say, firms still with trust and any client entity have a requirement to know the customer. With trust specifically, that means, among other things, knowing who the settlor is, knowing who the trustees are, knowing who the beneficiaries are, and if there's a protector, knowing who that is.
And there's no 25% limit for not registering beneficiaries here?
No, the firm needs to know who's going to benefit from it. If they're named individuals, the firm needs to know who these people are. And certainly when they reach the age of 18, they need to verify the ownership, the individuals.
Isn't there a risk here that we set up a discretionary trust, we invest the money, say, look, this is the discretionary trust, have a look at the documents. You can see the range of possible beneficiaries, they're quite broad. Then what we do is, when we finish the investment process, we transfer the proceeds of sale of any funds to a apparently reputable bank in an EU country which may or may not have quite the same level of surveillance in this area as one might wish. And then it's paid out to a politically exposed person, somebody corrupt, a government official, anything.
Well, the scenario you described, in that case, the firm shouldn't make the payment, because the firm, before it makes the payment, needs to know who is going to benefit from the payout. So the firm, if it's a discretionary trust, the firm will need to know the types of clients. And if, for example, in a charitable trust, you will not be identifying individuals, but where individuals in this case are being paid out, you need to know who they are.
They may not be identified by this point, and all you say is, I'm going to be paying out to beneficiaries in country X, and so I need the funds in that country to make the payment a bit more straightforward. So please transfer it to a well-known branch of a well-known international bank in a slightly dodgy neighbourhood, and that can be used as quite a nice little way of getting around the problem.
Yeah, well, I think if a firm does that, makes a payment out of those circumstances, I think it's breached its regulations.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect there's quite a lot of companies doing just that. So what are the areas where this all goes wrong in practice?
I think the difficulty can be in complex structures in particular is actually satisfying yourself that you do know who controls the company. And in various cases, firms do get that wrong. They don't actually close it off properly and get back to the ultimate beneficial owner, or the structure doesn't make sense and they haven't documented that the structure makes sense. That's where it can go wrong. And and in some cases where they do work out how it works, they haven't then verified the people behind the entity.
Thank you very much.